right, the EU book. Hey there everyone, Afrodo Reviews here, helping you decide, is that book worth reading over second breakfast? Or does it deserve the fiery pits of Mount Doom? Let's decide. I knew you'd end up over here. Stop beating your feet, please. Rogue Planet is a Star Wars EU book written by author Greg Bear and released on January 1st of 2001. At least that's what I could find. It was released after The Phantom Menace, but before Attack of the Clones in the Star Wars timeline. The book reflects that as a timeline perspective as well, taking place 3 years after from where The Phantom Menace concluded, but before the Clone Wars had truly begun. It features both Anakin and Obi-Wan somewhere between the characterizations they have in those two movies. It deals with a standalone plot that ultimately hints at something that takes place much further in the future, after Return of the Jedi. Not quite, it doesn't follow the Disney canon, it follows the EU canon, so, the better story. But that's all I can figure in the background worth noting at this particular moment, so here's your ratings. Now let's get on where we always start. The cover. Now the cover for this book is meh. Okay, I don't have okay. So the front cover features Obi-Wan half cloaked in shadow as he has a green lightsaber out in front of him, notably not his distinct blue. In the foreground you have a slightly older Anakin from Phantom Menace, but not quite before he reaches Attack of the Clones, staring blankly just off into the distance, pretty much dead-eyed, while just barely made out due to how much space they take up, but much more clearly on the back, is a thick, interconnected sort of jungle, or hinting at the planet that they're going to be going to, the titular rogue planet. And about all I can say. It doesn't tell us really anything about this book itself, apart from, it does tell us the timeline it takes place with both Anakin and Obi-Wan's appearances. Also with Obi-Wan's green lightsaber is kind of weird. I think that's why I believed it was Qui-Gon Jinn the first time I saw this book and remembered it, is because Obi-Wan doesn't have a green lightsaber. But apart from that, it's just meh. I'm not really a fan of just taking real actors and photoshopping them onto book covers, even if it is the actors who played the characters. So I don't really have much to say on that. It's very okay. It's not bad, but I wouldn't call it a good cover either. Let's move on to the synopsis. Now, I read the back of this book on my TBR. I've been forgetting to put the cards lately, but I will try to remember to put a link up above, as I used to do. But for a quick basic idea, a Jedi Knight by the name of Vergere. I don't know how it's supposed to be said. Again, it's Star Wars, so it could be said by any of these methods. But a Jedi Knight by the name of Vergere is sent to this titular rogue planet about a year ago, but she hasn't been in contact with the Council since then. After Anakin basically causes some issues as a Padawan by getting himself and his master involved in extreme sports in the Coruscant's lower districts, the Council decides to send them two to go try to find this Jedi Knight and figure out why she stopped reporting in, as a mixture of a mission and a trial for them. However, something else to notice is that during this time when Anakin and Obi-Wan were stuck at doing these extreme sports, Anakin was almost killed by, I hope I can say that, was almost unalived by an assassin who had been hired to, it seemed like to go after him, but it also hints that it might have been going after just Jedi in general. While Anakin and Obi-Wan go to this titular rogue planet, dark forces are also in work. A character named Wrath Senior, again, I hope I'm saying that right. I know he pops up later. I just know the name pops up later. I'm not exactly sure who the character is. Wilhof Tarkin are also at work trying to get a hold of this titular rogue planet. You see, this rogue planet makes the fastest ships in the galaxy, and they want to seize the productions at which they do it, converting it to what they're hinting at is slowly becoming the Empire. Tarkin hints that he already knows that's where it's going to go. But the reason they haven't been able to get one just yet is because it appears these ships are techno-organic, mentally bonding with the pilot that they are specifically made for. So, assuming that the pilot dies, the ship dies too. And it creates this whole mystery of suspension. What exactly is going on this rogue planet? How can they make techno-organic ships to such a great degree? Well, you gotta read and find out. And to be honest, and I'll go into the review from there. And to be honest, I don't know what to say about this book. I'm not being hyperbolic here, saying that the book did something that just caused me to stop and think, or the book was so good or bad that it left me in a stunned silence. It's just, I don't know what to say about this book. For all intents and purposes, Greg Bear wrote a Star Wars EU novel that's a book. This is about as perfect an example as I can give of just a mid-tier book in general, not just in the EU. Legitimately, nothing I have read before fits so smoothly into that category. It's just there. It exists. There are things I did like, I suppose. There are things I didn't like. But for the most part, everything was just... A part of that might be because for most of this book, Anakin and Obi-Wan are passive protagonists. I've kind of made it clear what I thought of passive... Okay, I've kind of made it clear in the past what I thought about passive protagonists in general. I don't necessarily like them because it leaves the book without a sense of urgency or direction that I feel a book should really have. And they can work, don't get me wrong, they can work, they're just not interesting to read for me. But what I mean by that is the passive. They're sent to find this Jedi Knight who went missing, but it's not actually until page 240, of which this book only has about 330 pages, that Anakin and Obi-Wan take active steps to do anything. Even when they're investigating this planet and posing as buyers, they don't investigate, they don't sneak out of their rooms and creep around the city at night looking for anything. They don't interrogate anyone trying to figure out, hey, we had a friend who came through here, but she hasn't contacted us since she landed. Obi-Wan basically is just going with the flow to see if they just so happen to stumble upon something that tells them what happened to the missing Jedi Knight.
Wait a minute. How did this happen? We're smarter than this.
Apparently not.
And while this does let Greg Bear explore what I believe is one of the most genuinely interesting planets in the Star Wars, EU canon at this point, it does just sort of make it hard to read because things are happening. That Obi-Wan isn't pushing anything. We're getting these great, grand descriptions, and okay, but what's it leading to? Nothing really. I mean, you know for a fact that Obi-Wan and Anakin getting one of these techno-organic ships made for them isn't going to last because it doesn't pop up in Attack of the Clones. I don't even think if you had read this when it first came out, before Attack of the Clones was out, you would have really fell for it because a techno-organic ship would be such a great leap from what they ended the first movie on to the second movie. A lot of people would just be like, wait, what? I would have loved to see him get that ship rather than just him having that ship. So you kind of already know the foregone conclusion to most of this passive, we'll let them make the ship for us while we hope something stumbles upon us for the Jedi Knight. In fact, I actually started to welcome the perspective shift to the antagonists, Sanir and Tarkin, because as short as they were and the fact that they were villains, at least they were doing something to push their part of the plot forward. Again, Anakin and Obi-Wan just sort of exist in their plot. They just sort of let things happen. It's not interesting to read in that sense. It's just what's happening is interesting, but it's not interesting because nothing is pushing this stuff to happen. We're just getting things happening. And I guess part of the reason I don't find this terribly boring is, again, it's exploring the world that I feel is genuinely interesting, but it has a mystery that sort of appears. I will admit that I didn't guess what the mystery was. I kind of thought it'd be something else that it ended up being. There is that mystery of just what's going on this planet, what's so weird about it, how they make these techno-organic ships, why people seem to be slightly off. the mysterious Magister and his palace. There's just a lot there that make you think, okay, what's going on here? It keeps you invested enough that you want to keep reading, but the actual sections where you read to get to that are just kind of boring. I guess is a good way of putting it. You aren't engaged while you read to that point, but you are engaged to find out what the twist is. In fact, I think I would say the only real big complaint that I have to levy against this book is its writing style, and even then, it's one of the smaller ones. For the people who have been a long time fan of this channel, you might remember my Primordia review back way back then. I think that was like the 6th book I ever reviewed. No, not even that. I think that was like the 4th book I ever reviewed. Point is, I reviewed a book called Primordia well back in the day. And I talked about how, while it was surprisingly good, one of the ways it was written bothered me. Because chapters would be a very inconsistent length. Some chapters would be a little half paragraph long, while other chapters would be 20 plus pages. And it created such an odd pacing that it was hard to read at times, because those fast chapters went by really fast. But when you got to the long chapters, since they were so out of the ordinary, they were so long in comparison to everything else in the book, you're just aware that the chapter is dragging. And it just feels like at a certain point you start asking yourself, okay, why is this still going? When is this going to end? The book does that here. Look, about half a page long, and then you have a chapter that's several pages long right next to it. But this is another one of those things where it annoyed me, but... okay, so that annoyed me in the beginning. But when we got to the actual conflict and when we got to the part of the book where things were happening, our characters were doing stuff, I actually felt it worked, because the choppy chapters, the inconsistent lengths, they were actually helping add to the confusion and the chaos of the unfolding battle that was currently happening. And it did enhance the book in that way. But before that, it's just something that breaks up the pacing to the point that you get annoyed with it. So again, it's one of those good and bad at the same time, resulting in it being meh. Apart from that, the continuity is a little nippy here. This book was published before Attack of the Clones came out, so obviously that was to be expected. But there are a couple things that I know conflict with the mainstream canon and then the later EU canon. One thing is that it hints that Tarkin and Sinir knew about the Death Star plans and were already pushing them into the Senate well before even Attack of the Clones revealed the origins of Death Star plans and what the original plan was. In addition, as I said, it hints at events that take place in the EU canon after Return of the Jedi. For those of you who know the Yuzon Vong, that hints at that storyline. And while I haven't read too much on those, I do know a couple things about the storyline that this also counteracts in terms of that canon as well. Apart from that, the ending is a little forced. As I said, Greg Bear clearly wanted to do something great and interesting, but due to the fact that it was an EU book, it was clear there was going to be no lasting consequences that would affect the Attack of the Clones coming up. So obviously the grand thing that he's building to has to have a forced ending that prevents it from showing up later. And I thought it didn't quite go where I went, but it was just disappointing because it was one of those, yeah, I saw this coming, but it was still... I would have gone with something else that would have been more interesting. A couple things I did like was that the book does hint that Sidious is already working on manipulating Anakin even as young as 12, which does help how fast he switches the Sidious side in the third movie if you don't watch, the animated Clone Wars, which I still believe is a masterclass of fixing problems with the prequels. I also like the characterization of Anakin in this a lot more. Anakin feels a lot more like a kid who's had a hard life rather than necessarily the wooden board that was pretending to be a kid in the movies.
Now this is pod racing.
And I know child actors, I can't blame the actor too much for that. but it is one of those, he actually feels like a kid in this. And a couple of the Jedi even get called out on the fact that they're trying to treat him like a Jedi already made rather than the kid he needs to be for a bit. It also gives us an Obi-Wan who isn't as wise and confident as he is later on that we see, so that was kind of interesting to see. Although I kind of made fun of the fact that Obi-Wan has a green lightsaber, I do think it's a slightly nice touch that it's Qui-Gon Jinn's lightsaber in this book, because he hasn't had a chance to go make his new one. I think at this point it hadn't really been solidified how Jedi make their lightsabers, so maybe Barrett thought that Obi-Wan was going to start using Qui-Gon's lightsaber in Attack of the Clones. So on one hand, it does feel a little forced, but on the other, it's sort of one of those, it's a nice touch. If Greg didn't know that wasn't really solidified, the Kyber crystals and how a Jedi goes on the quest and all that. So yeah. So again, all in all, it's just one of those, it's okay. I mean, I don't have any major complaints against it, but I don't really have any major praises for it either. There's really not much to say about this book overall. So 5 out of 10. Yeah, honestly, I'm not sure what else to say about this book. It's almost like a masterclass of contradictions. A lot of the things I can say about this book is, I like this, but I didn't like this. I like this, but I didn't like this. Everything I liked had a counteracting I didn't like as well. And the things that I hadn't felt strongly about are strictly middle of the road. It's not, well, I can see why people would like it, but I didn't. Or, I like this, but I can see why people didn't. It's just very much middle of the road. That happened. I would say the book is ultimately the most interesting at the last 90 pages when Tarkin finally launches his attack on the rogue planet, and the heroes are forced to deal with the continuously unfolding chaos while also learning the truth about what the planet really is, what's really going on the planet. But unfortunately, due to our protagonist's passiveness throughout much of the story, it's not as oomph as it should have been. It doesn't really feel like they earned the ending that they get. It feels like, okay, we have to actually start trying now. And then they got what they wanted. The best way I can honestly describe this book is Greg Bear got hired to write a sci-fi book, but not necessarily a Star Wars book. So the question of whether or not this deserves Mount Doom is no. I mean, again, I'm torn on that. It's not a terrible book, but I don't really think there's much here that's necessarily I would recommend going out to read. I mean, if you need something to read and this is the only thing available, yeah, go ahead and read it. But I can recommend a couple EU books already off the top of my head that I would recommend reading before this. But I would also recommend a couple of EU books that I know about that I would say stay away from and read this instead. Again, it's so middle of the road that it's hard to talk about. It's a book that I'll probably end up forgetting I even read in a couple years, to be completely honest with you. So yeah, that's what I gotta say. I guess it might be worth a read if we're going on a purely it's a sci-fi recommendation, but that's about it. That's really all I have to say. I am struggling to say more. But anyways, on to the next adventure within the Star Wars EU. We leap forward in time. Obi-Wan and Anakin captured by the Separatist Republic. The Jedi casting aside their careful neutralness to go join them, becoming generals in a war that would soon sweep the galaxy. Getting an army of cloned Mandalorian troopers made from the genome of Jango Fett, taking place in conflicts throughout the entire galaxy. Man, I certainly hope MedStar is ready for all those bodies coming on. But until then, remember, with every book comes an adventure, and every adventure's worth having, even the bad ones.